Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait for more people to join the room before we get started. But while we wait, this is a Balfour Project webinar, which we are very excited to have announced. It's a webinar on UNRWA and the Palestinian refugees at a crossroad with Dr. Lex Takkenberg. But while we wait for everyone to join, let me just tell you that the Balfour Project stands for Peace, Justice and Equal Rights in Israel and Palestine, with the mission of acknowledging Britain's continuing historic responsibilities to uphold equal rights for the Israeli and Palestinian peoples through popular education and advocacy, and to convince the British government to recognize the state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel. We have quite a lot of attendees registered for this webinar. It's not surprising because it's such a topical issue at the moment. Many of you are regulars, so you'll know to put your questions in the chat box, and at the end we will go through as many questions as we have time for. We never have time for all of them, so please don't be offended if we don't have a chance to address your question. I try to cover ones from every kind of area. I'm going to take this opportunity to tell you that we have a conference on the 8th of May on the rule of law in the region. So I will be popping a link in the chat box once the webinar starts so that you can have a little look and register. It will be hybrid. It's at King's College on the Strand, but it's also online. So if it's not possible for you to come into town, into London, then you can watch it all online. We, as always, will be recording it and sharing it after the fact as well. Our speakers are always speaking on their own behalf as guests of the Balfour Project. And today you might have noticed that we're also joined by Andrew Whitley, our chair. So we've got the numbers roughly stabilizing in the room. So I am going to introduce the two of them. We've got Dr. Lex Takkenberg, who is a senior advisor on the question of Palestine at Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development based in Jordan. And he's worked in various field and headquarter positions at UNRWA. So he is a leading authority on UNRWA and the issues it's having today. We've also got Andrew Whitley, our chair, who's founder and executive director of Geopolitical Advisory Services, a UK-based consultancy that works on the alleviation of armed conflict in the Middle East and Asia. And he has had a very illustrious career in journalism, working for the Elders, Human Rights Watch Middle East and North Africa Division, and also working for positions in the UN, including at UNRWA. So we couldn't have two better people speaking to us. And Andrew will come back after Lex does his presentation to us all, and they will have a little conversation, and then we will round up the hour with some questions from the audience. So as I mentioned before, do pop your questions in the chat box. Neither of our speakers today will be looking at the chat box during the presentation. I will relay questions to them. They will be shared the chat box afterwards, so they will see any questions and comments that you have for them. So please do feel free to put any notes in there that you have for our speakers. We have also submitted, you would have received an email if you're on our mailing list today about the evidence that the Balfour Project submitted to the Foreign Affairs Committee on the issue of Israel-Palestine. So do recommend that you have a little look at that, and I'm sure Andrew will address it as well. So I am going to hand over to Lex, and then when Lex is finished presenting, Andrew will come back, and then I will pop back for the Q&A session. So over to you, Lex.
Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you to the Balfour Project, and also thank you, Andrew, as its founder and executive director, for inviting me. I'm very happy for the opportunity. What I intend to do in my 15 to 20 minutes or so is to give you a little intro about UNRWA for those of you who are not, who have heard of UNRWA but who are not more familiar with exactly what the organization does. I will then speak briefly about the Israeli attacks on UNRWA, culminating in the recent ban of UNRWA by the Israeli Knesset. I'll tell a little bit about give you a sort of an update on the state of implementation of this ban, which went into force at the end of January, and then conclude with a few remarks on sort of the way forward for Palestinian refugees and UNRWA. So let me begin with a few words about UNRWA. UNRWA is the UN relief and works agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. It was created about a year and a half after the Nakba, after the initial mass flight of Palestinians from those parts of Palestine that were became the new state of Israel, and ended up in sort of neighboring territories and countries. UNRWA and UNHCR were created at the same week of December 1949. UNHCR initially to deal with the residual, mostly predominantly Jewish refugee problem in Europe, and UNRWA to deal with the sort of the secondary victims of the Holocaust, the Palestinians who had to flee. UNHCR later became the global UN refugee agency, whilst UNRWA remained focused on the Palestinian refugee question. UNRWA was created as an agency to continue the humanitarian assistance that its predecessors, a number of international NGOs, had started following the summer of 48, and also to implement public works projects that were envisaged by the UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine as an alternative to refugee return. The initial focus of the UN General Assembly in December 48 was that a solution to the refugee situation should be found through return of the refugees to their original home in historic Palestine. A conciliation commission for Palestine was created, chaired by the US and Turkey and France as members, to try to achieve that. And when they realized that Israel was not ready to take refugees back, not even a partial return, they started shifting focus and started looking at sort of integrating the refugees in the initial countries of refuge. And for that, they envisaged large public work schemes modeled, interestingly, on the so-called Tennessee Valley Authority, a New Deal US program to initiate employment in the Tennessee Valley after the crisis years of the late 1920s and 1930s. And that's how UNRWA got going. Now, these large-scale public work schemes never really got off the ground, primarily because both the host countries and the refugees themselves remained focused on return and were suspicious at large-scale efforts to sort of resettle and integrate the refugees into the host countries. Very interesting, as in relation also to the sort of the outlandish proposals by Trump with respect to sort of resettling the Palestinians from Gaza and Jordan and Egypt. But the refugees, continue to be there and continue to need assistance, and that then evolved into a situation where UNRWA became a large public service agency organization providing, public-like services such as basic education, vocational training, comprehensive primary healthcare services, continued relief and also increasingly social services, microfinance and support for infrastructure, for camp infrastructure, water, sanitation, but also rehabilitation and sometimes reconstruction of housing. So it became a very large organization because of this. directly implementing, contrary to its sister agency UNHCR, which has been traditionally working through implementing partners. UNRWA has directly implemented its programs from sort of the beginning until the present moment. That's why it's an organization with about 30,000 predominantly local employees. There's less than 1% international staff amongst the workforce of around 30,000, of whom 17,000 work in the occupied Palestinian territory, the majority in Gaza, and there's about 4,000 in the West Bank. Is beyond the occupied Palestinian territory. UNRWA also operates in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, the other three countries where large numbers of Palestinian refugees ended up following the Nakba. And so it is in those 5 areas, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, that UNRWA operates. It is a subsidiary organ of the UN General Assembly, and receives donor funding from interestingly predominantly the countries that are also sort of supporters of Israel. And for a long time, UNRWA was seen by the West, and in particular also by the US, who was sort of instrumental in UNRWA's founding, as sort of a cushion of support for Israel, as a stabilizer of an otherwise tumultuous region. Now that brings me to sort of UNRWA's relationship with Israel, culminating in the recent ban of the organization by the Israeli Knesset. Whilst Israel derived its initial sort of legitimacy and foundational sort of support through the partition resolution that the UN General Assembly adopted in late 1947, followed by Israel's admission to the UN. Israel has had sort of a bumpy relationship with the UN at large, and it quite rapidly discovered that sort of in that context, UNRWA was sort of the weak underbelly of the UN system because of its very large Palestinian workforce, or it could easily be criticized for allegations of involvement of its staff with terrorist groups, initially PLO and its different factions, and for the last 2 decades Hamas in Gaza, and to a lesser extent in the West Bank and Lebanon. Israel also discovered that the textbooks that were being used in UNRWA schools, which were not UNRWA textbooks, but textbooks of the host authorities, often reflected the existing state of play with respect to, you know, the unresolved sort of warlike situation, conflict situation. And Israel started making allegations of anti-Semitism with respect to parts of the content of textbooks as early as the sort of a few years after the Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And attacks on UNRWA's textbooks have been sort of an ongoing refrain for the last 50 years, and often not just sort of causing dissonance between the agency and Israel, but through Israelis' advocacy and sort of pro-Israeli lobby, also influencing the parliaments of many donor countries, you know, supporting UNRWA with financial contributions. So that's one part of the sort of the UNRWA-Israeli relationship. And then I already mentioned allegations that local UNRWA staff were involved in in acts of terrorism. Now, until I would say the onset of the current Israeli government, and then the start of the war on 7 October 23, these attacks were frequent and often fierce, but never existential, never sort of reaching a point that Israel was really trying to close the agency down. That started with the arrival of the new government, and in particular after 7 October, further escalating when when 4 months later, exactly on the day that the International Court of Justice issued its first ruling on the South Africa genocide case, it was revealed that, or allegations were made public, that 12 UNRWA local staff were allegedly involved in the 7 October attacks. And that sort of then triggered suspension of funding, initially by the US and then up to another 15 countries. That further then resulted in, or in response to those allegations, 2 reviews were initiated. One, official misconduct allegations into the specific individuals by the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services, and a second, more systemic review by French foreign Mr. Colonna and 3 Scandinavian institutes, sort of looking at UNRWA's management of neutrality as an organization of humanitarian neutrality in its operations. In the meantime, in the whole aftermath and in the context of the war in Gaza, and the very strong calls for revenge by Israeli politicians, members of the Knesset, and also general public, UNRWA got embroiled in that, not surprisingly, being the biggest agency supporting the Palestinian refugees in Gaza and in the West Bank. Got embroiled in that, and that resulted over last summer in 3 different members of the Israeli Knesset submitting bills to sort of attack and sort of attempt to ban UNRWA. One of these 3 bills, trying to declare UNRWA a terrorist organization, was revoked. The other 2 were adopted at the end of October, on the 28th of October. One prohibiting UNRWA's operations in southern Israeli territory, which, as UNRWA is not operating elsewhere in Israel, but Israel has unilaterally annexed the West Bank, which focuses specifically on UNRWA operations in East Jerusalem. Sorry, annexed East Jerusalem, not the West Bank that may be ahead, but not at the time. So one of the 2 laws focuses on prohibiting UNRWA's operations in East Jerusalem, as defined by Israel and in its annexation of East Jerusalem law. And the second ban putting in place, the second law putting in place a no contact policy between Israeli government officials and UNRWA, covering not just East Jerusalem, but also the remainder of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So that's the legal nature of the ban. The ban came into effect 90 days after its adoption, in spite of very strong political and also legal challenges of the ban by the Secretary General, by the General Assembly, debates in the Security Council, but no no resolution from the Security Council, not surprisingly. A challenge led by Norway to request a further advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, complementing the momentous opinion that was rendered last July on the illegality of the occupation. And also a challenge in front of the High Court of Israel, which the ICJ advisory opinion proceeding is ongoing, and the High Court of Justice of Israel refused to provide an injunction, and there is indeed a further proceeding also still underway there, but that's not likely to yield any results. So the ban went into force at the end of January, and UNRWA had to anticipate what to do and how to respond to it. Although the UN Secretary General, from the premise that the ban was illegal and that UNRWA could not be replaced, ordered sort of a stay and deliver policy, and sort of essentially did not want to engage in contingency planning for the day after. But UNRWA had sort of preventively emptied or abandoned its East Jerusalem field office, which also accommodated certain headquarters functions. And from the entry into force of the ban, has asked its the staff of that headquarters premise to stay at home, and for those who could to work at home. The other UNRWA installations in East Jerusalem have continued to function. At the beginning of the week, there was an Israeli member of Knesset who wrote sort of a complaint to Netanyahu that, 3 weeks after the ban had entered into force, there was zero visible implementation action. So the day later, Netanyahu issued a statement that implementation of the ban would start immediately, and then again a day later on Tuesday, Israel raided one of the vocational training centers in Kalandia, in the West Bank, but in that part of the West Bank that Israel considers part of Jerusalem, as well as 3 schools in East Jerusalem. There was an UNRWA statement sort of suggesting that these installations were closed, but my understanding is that this is not strictly speaking the case. They were reopened yesterday morning, and for now Israel has refrained from further action to put closure to these operations. In Gaza, UNRWA had to also, because visa were not renewed, UNRWA had to relocate its 30 or so international staff working in both its headquarters and West Bank field office operations in East Jerusalem, and these staff have been relocated to Amman, and the West Bank field office staff continue to remotely sort of manage the field operations, the ongoing field operations. In the remainder of the West Bank, things are until now sort of business as usual. And the same more or less applies in the Gaza Strip, where UNRWA has until this moment 9 international staff in place, whose visa have, however, expired, and Israel is putting pressure that they be evacuated as third country nationals because it no longer recognizes their visa. And as pressure is mounting, the expectation is that in a couple of weeks they will indeed have to leave the Strip. Now, the sort of the non-contact dimension of the ban means that indeed UNRWA cannot renew visa, it cannot import goods. It's a question mark when on the longer term it can continue to make financial transactions, including payment of salaries. So there is really a dark cloud hanging over the UNRWA operations. And what we're sort of seeing is that even though UNRWA is still by and large operating without change, it is expected that it will gradually, UNRWA's role will gradually erode, both in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in East Jerusalem. What does that mean for the future? One important point to make is that for Palestinian refugees, their refugee status, their status as persons who are to be treated as refugees by the international refugee regime, who have rights as refugees and historic claims as refugees, claims related to return, to compensation, to restitution. That status does not depend on UNRWA's ability to continue to deliver services. Their status is independent of that. Their status existed even before UNRWA was established, and UNRWA had made arrangements several years ago to allow refugees to update their registration particulars so that UNRWA can maintain its database of the Palestinian refugees through a mobile phone app. And even before 7 October 23, this app was very, very widely used by the refugees in all the 5 fields where UNRWA operates. So the updating of refugee records and preserving the refugee status is secured and is not dependent on the agency's ability to continue to deliver services. This is very important. Practically, for the service delivery, the expectation is that in East Jerusalem, Israel will gradually prevent the agency from further operating and will sort of direct school children to go to existing Palestinian Israeli managed schools in East Jerusalem for sort of the school system for non-refugee Palestinians in East Jerusalem. The same for health services and social services. This is not expected to be sort of a seamless transition, so it is likely to be bumpy, and there are likely to be people falling between the cracks. In the West Bank, Israel had suggested that UNRWA hand over its education and primary healthcare system to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority has, for obvious reasons, sort of declined to even entertain the idea. And then for now, Israel has sort of backed off and has not announced any vision of how it sees the provision of education and health services to be provided in the West Bank. And an important footnote is that under international humanitarian law, Israel as an occupying power is required to provide humanitarian services to the occupied population if no other such arrangements are available. And this was actually one of the reasons why Israel requested in 1967 UNRWA to continue its operations in the OPT in the first place. In Gaza, UNRWA's futures, or rather the future of the services that UNRWA has traditionally been providing, and there is currently a lot of focus on emergency humanitarian assistance, but the backbone of UNRWA's work is education and health services. And so as the education system and the health system have been largely destroyed, UNRWA's future in Gaza very much depends on who will eventually govern and rebuild the Gaza Strip. And we all know that we are in a very sort of fluid situation there. Trump's extreme plan of ethnic cleansing and turning Gaza into a Riviera of the Eastern Mediterranean, versus now Egyptian initiatives to try to rebuild Gaza while the refugees remain in place. So it very much depends on how that plays out in the coming weeks and months and years as to what will happen with the education and healthcare system in the Gaza Strip. Finally, to remember that UNRWA continues to operate also in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, until now without change. But there are concerns that sort of the Israeli attacks and then Trump's sort of strong rhetoric, including his continued defunding of UNRWA, will also negatively affect other donors. So indirectly the operations in the other fields may be affected as well, but how that will play out in the longer term is to be seen. Let me leave it at that, Diana and Andrew. Very, very happy to answer questions as they come up.
Thank you very much, Lex. And I think we can all agree that what we've heard is very fair and accurate, and I would add authoritative picture of what is the situation today affecting UNRWA and the Palestinian refugees. It also leaves a lot of questions up in the air, questions that probably neither of us have the answers to, or even many governments who are following this question. There's a great deal of uncertainty. You've pointed rightly to the distinction between UNRWA and the refugees being able to maintain their status, which is critically important. The question of who delivers services to them, whether it is the host authorities or NGOs or others, is up in the air, isn't it? But do you see any signs from your own knowledge of what's been going on, of any contingency planning, of any looking ahead to any alternative ways of being able to deliver the services? We both know that the host countries have been resistant to any ideas of UNRWA handing over its services for political reasons primarily. But I think, nevertheless, the writing seems to be on the wall. You have not mentioned Mr. Trump or the US Congress, but they have taken actions which are clearly going to be very critical for the future of UNRWA, in the sense that funding will be cut. They are taking legal actions against UNRWA. And many European donors, under pressure from other fronts also, including Ukraine, are also not necessarily rising to the challenge. So what do we see as the immediate way in which we can move from the present state of uncertainty to a more stable situation in which some 6 million refugees on UNRWA's books can have a more predictable future?
Very good points, Andrew, and indeed not an easy answer. First, indeed, I briefly mentioned the response of the Secretary General, also encouraged by the UNRWA Commissioner General, was we do not engage in contingency planning. This ban is illegal. It violates all kinds of provisions of international law, from the Convention on Privileges and Immunities to humanitarian law to the ICJ advisory opinion and the General Assembly resolution implementing it to the provisional orders by the ICJ in the genocide case. The effect of that was that indeed planning for the day after has started very slowly, and in some of my earlier writings and work with the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, we've also sort of said, yes, on the one hand, it's totally appropriate to continue to challenge the ban, but on the other hand, the humanitarian imperative requires that we also begin to look forward and see what the day after can bring or may require. Essentially, Israel preventing a UN agency to implement operations not in its own territory but in occupied territory is an outlandish measure. It has never happened that a UN agency was sort of threatened to be evicted like that. And so that is now with the International Court of Justice at the initiative of Norway. But it creates a situation that the international community's traditional long-term response to the Palestinian refugee question, as it concerns the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, is up in the air. And indeed, so the international community needs to go back to the drawing board in a way and consider how to amend its response in view of this new reality. Now, a couple of reflections there. In Gaza, of course, we see a big humanitarian system, different UN agencies coming together, working very closely with UNRWA. However, none of those is interested in UNRWA's core mandate, which is education, or interested nor specialized in UNRWA's core mandate of education and primary healthcare services. So that is one dilemma. I mentioned there a multitude of legal consequences of the ban. One of those is that under the 1951 Refugee Convention, which sort of suspended its application to Palestinian refugees who were assisted by UNRWA, contains a clause that if for whatever reason this protection or assistance comes to an end, these refugees become ipso facto entitled to the benefits of the Refugee Convention. And the protection of the rights of the convention is the responsibility of UNHCR, which under its statute also has an arrangement, a long-standing arrangement with UNRWA, that Palestinian refugees in UNRWA's area of operation are the concern of UNRWA, and Palestinian refugees outside UNRWA's area of operation are persons of concern of UNHCR. And so this division of responsibility is now also upended. UNHCR is very reluctant about it. The High Commissioner is obviously concerned about getting embroiled in the Palestinian refugee question for the not unlikely risk that it may also attract further scrutiny by the Trump administration and eventual sort of cut down of funding. But UNHCR is present in Israel, and as according to Israel, East Jerusalem is part of sovereign Israel. UNHCR today, or the moment that UNRWA is indeed, UNRWA is today prohibited from working in East Jerusalem. So one can argue that the refugees there have become persons of concern of UNHCR. Now, UNHCR is a very different animal compared to UNRWA. I already mentioned UNRWA directly implements, UNHCR does not do that. But there's still a few benefits of UNHCR coming to the table and bringing its expertise, because it is the global agency that has 7 decades or 75 years of experience in dealing with large-scale refugee situations, including protracted ones. It has a model whereby it works towards comprehensive response framework to refugee crisis, bringing in a multitude of different actors. And I've argued in some of my writing that this sort of approach might provide a way forward with respect to the current situation in Gaza and now increasingly also in the West Bank. So where you get UNHCR's experience to be brought to the table, also in forming a coalition of agencies and partnerships with host countries and donors and civil society, as UNHCR is used to, that can sort of provide a comprehensive response to the new situation. So
Lex, forgive me interrupting you, but
no,
time,
go ahead.
Our time is running short, and I see many good questions coming in from our viewers. I'm really going to ask only one more, which is this. You mentioned in your remarks that UNRWA had traditionally been seen by the US and other Israel supporters as a stabilizing force. What changed? Why is it then that suddenly, that as many had considered UNRWA's role to be one that was helpful from an Israeli perspective, what has actually happened so that they no longer see that? Have they changed their minds about UNRWA being a stabilizing force, or is it that some politicians have overridden the advice that come from more sensible, security-minded people?
The latter. As Israel's the center of Israel's political life has moved significantly to the right, the influence, the traditional influence of the security establishment, which has seen the defense and security establishment, which were the first to sort of recognize. It was Moshe Dayan at the time that made the case that that UNRWA should be encouraged to, or should be requested to continue its operations. You know, with the decline of that sort of reasoning in reasoning and influencing sort of Israeli political decision making. And more extreme visions towards, you know, greater Israel, towards erasing the Palestinian refugee question, finishing the Nakba, essentially what the ICJ has suggested, a plausible cause that the rights under the Genocide Convention may have been affected, and that that entails a preliminary opinion about sort of genocidal intent. You know, and essentially UNRWA, you know, as Israel has in its war in Gaza attacked many Palestinian institutions, from schools to universities to hospitals to sewage treatment plants, etc., etc. It is not surprising that it also attacks the principal organization that has been established by the UN as an embodiment of its permanent responsibility towards the Palestinian refugee question.
Lex, I'm going to be accused of ducking difficult questions if I don't ask you one about the political nature of UNRWA, because you know perfectly well, as a legal expert and as a historian of the refugee question and of the agency, that unlike UNHCR, that UNRWA is a highly political agency. It's got politics in its core. Its staff are highly politicized. And that's hardly surprising. These are educated Palestinians, many of them living under occupation. They're themselves, many of them, refugees. And so they have a very different outlook to their work and their role and the identity of the agency than, let's say, a UNHCR local field staff would have in Africa. We know there's an important difference here because of the nature of the political nature of the Palestinian refugee question, which the Israelis are trying to get at here. So what is going to happen with that? Let's say many of those local staff are no longer going to be employed by UNRWA if UNRWA is unable to work in the occupied territories. What is going to happen there? Are they able to continue working in different agencies, or would they work with the Palestinian Authority? How do you see this working out in practice?
It again very much depends on sort of who takes over elements of UNRWA's work, if it indeed comes to that, and we're not sure yet. The Trump dynamic and the erratic nature of his engagement, and also his desire to sort of lure Saudi Arabia into a normalization agreement with Israel, so may change the dynamics again. But what we already sort of see happen is that in Gaza, the other humanitarian agencies realize that if they need to hire staff, by far the best qualified and trained staff with, experience and the trust of the refugee community and the wider Palestinian community in Gaza, these are the natural candidates that they will hire. And even when Cindy McCain, the executive director of World Food Program, was sort of urged by Netanyahu to sort of scale up her involvement, or World Food Program's involvement in the Gaza Strip, and she said, how do we get staff? I mean, it was even Netanyahu who sort of ironically suggested, she hire UNRWA employees that UNRWA itself that Israel itself had been criticizing for lack of neutrality. So there are a lot of ironies there. And then obviously, I mean, if Gaza will get rebuilt at some point, and that rebuilding needs to include the education and the health sector. Whoever will operate that, whether it's an international entity, whether it's a PA, whether it's a new Palestinian arrangement, as is also being sort of suggested by Egypt at the moment, it needs education and healthcare people, and of course, where to pick those, amongst the former UNRWA employees. That's the logical thing. One thing UNRWA could do is to make itself available through its headquarters as the technical advisor on primary health care and education for whatever new arrangement that is put in place, in renewing its partnerships with UNESCO and with WHO. So in a kind of tripartite arrangement, provide the technical guidance and support and supervision of those operations. Ironically, removing UNRWA from the educational system in Gaza and the West Bank also removes UNRWA's, elaborate system of managing neutrality of the education system, scrutinizing textbooks, developing complementary education materials, having a human rights curriculum, etc., etc. So a lot of the things that have sort of mitigated some of the impacts of this highly politicized context that you refer to would be removed if UNRWA is not there.
Indeed. Look, I'm not going to abuse my position anymore, so I'm going to invite Diana to be able to relay some of our audience's questions.
Hello, thank you. We've had, as you saw, a whole bunch of really interesting questions. I'm going to bunch together a few. We've had a few on funding. So here's a combination of questions from Alan Gordon, Carol Archer, Chris August, and Patricia Rogers. Basically, what they're asking is, what was the impact of the Knesset ban? What has the impact been on UNRWA funding? And should we still be donating to UNRWA? Will they receive it? Will they be able to do anything useful with it?
Starting with the latter, absolutely, it remains critical for both state donors and others to continue to support the agency. I asked it an update from UNRWA senior management last night, and up till this moment, it's able to make payments, to receive payments, to make payments, to transfer money from its account in the US to the Bank of Palestine. So absolutely, indeed. In terms of impact, after the initial defunding by 16 donors, following the Colonna report that I mentioned, 15 of them came back. Only the US Congress extended the ban. until early this year, and then the Trump administration now has confirmed that it will also continuing to not renew funding to UNRWA. The others came back. However, unfortunately, Sweden has recently announced that, or has recently decided to cut UNRWA funding, with a threat of defunding the agency, also currently happening in Switzerland and in the Netherlands. So there are a couple of donors that have sort of joined the American anti-UNRWA rhetoric, but the majority have stayed put, and many have even increased their funding. And in particular, UNRWA has also received, since the start of the war in October 23, unprecedented private sector funding from individuals, as well as from groups like UNRWA Spain and UNRWA USA that have raised through private fundraising sort of vast amounts of money, and are now amongst, especially USA, Spain, amongst the agency's largest donors. So by all means, please continue to fund. Other donors are sort of sitting on the fence a bit and waiting to see what will happen. But the expectation is, and with the continued, there is now also the Global Alliance for the Two-State Solution, which is a new political initiative by the EU and Saudi Arabia to sort of try to revive the peace process towards a two-state solution, and UNRWA's role in that frame has also been acknowledged quite significantly and repeatedly. So I do expect that UNRWA will retain a strong donor base, but as the agency has continued to be in a financial crisis for almost for most of the turn since the turn of the century, it will not be easy.
Thank you for that. We've got a question from Philippa Whitford, who is one of our patrons and former SNP MP. She says, and she's a doctor by trade, having worked in Gaza as a surgeon, I'm aware from colleagues there that the healthcare service in the Strip has been decimated, including the destruction of hospitals, clinics, and the 2 medical schools, as well as killing of staff. In Gaza, is it even remotely possible to envision healthcare recovery without UNRWA? And I've got a follow-up question from Susan Murphy, who basically asked the same thing about the education system. How many schools were destroyed, and how are there any UNRWA schools that are able to continue offering education? You touched on this before in your previous question.
On the health front, yes, quite a few health centers were demolished in the fighting or severely damaged. A number have recently, since the start of the ceasefire, been renovated, very fast, and are back in service, including the Rafah Health Center. In the meantime, UNRWA's medical staff in Gaza, close to 2,000, have continued to provide improvised primary healthcare services almost from day one, using those health centers that still stood, using mobile clinic models that the agency had already put in place in sort of more remote villages, putting health points in the UNRWA schools that have been turned into emergency shelters, accommodating displaced Palestinians during the war. So UNRWA has continued to operate its primary healthcare system against all odds, with very courageous staff and supplies not only provided through UNRWA's own supply line, but also by WHO, by UN OCHA, and by others. You will recall the polio vaccination, which was led by WHO, but was implemented by those primary healthcare workers of UNRWA. On the education system, obviously, a significant number of schools have been demolished, and the other schools cannot be used for normal educational purposes because they're doubling as emergency shelters. UNRWA has, however, from the earlier wars, a significant experience with digital learning programs, and has activated those as internet access and mobile phone access, and in a more limited scope, tablet access, allowed pupils to reconnect with their teachers. At the moment, there is a sizable digital learning program involving, the majority of the 8,000 UNRWA teachers in Gaza, with teachers texting their student using WhatsApp and other applications to have limited contact time with the teachers, but with the students, but giving them homework, and still trying to maintain some basic education going. What do we expect for the future if UNRWA is really unable to operate health and education? Well, as I indicated, there are no other UN agencies that are really equipped to take that over. So the only alternative is a host of smaller initiative NGOs that provide schools in a town or in part of a refugee camp, and partly the local public sector, whatever that is be. At the moment, it is still Hamas, but if there is an arrangement whereby Hamas agrees to sort of hand over to another governance mechanism, it will be, the only what comes, after UNRWA, that will determine how education can be scaled up again.
And this is the critical question, Lex, that we are all worried about: the governance of Gaza and the standoff that exists at the moment between the different perspectives that you hear from Washington, or from Israel, or from the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, or from the Arab countries. All of them have different views. There is no congruence of views yet as to how Gaza will be governed and who will ultimately be responsible for rebuilding those health services, for example, or helping to be able to manage the education needs, all the basics that people face at the moment. So the sooner the better that there is some agreement on what is going to take place, and there is a stable and secure environment in which these services can be delivered, then so much the better for all those poor people who are in such desperate conditions at the moment.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you both. I've got a question from RS, who I suspect is Roger Spooner, the founder of the Balfour Project. Given Trump's declared intention to seize and depopulate the Gaza Strip and the mulling over allowing Israel to annex more of the West Bank, do you think France and the UK are more likely to recognize Palestine? I'll let you decide who takes that one.
Lex, do you want to go for it? You want me to?
No.
All right. Okay. The issue of recognition of Palestine is very much in the air at the moment. I think that from the positions we've seen from the UK, that they're not ready to move on their own, and they're looking to France. France is under pressure to do so from Saudi Arabia as part of the preconditions for a big conference that's planned for New York in June, which is one of the issues that is up in the air at the moment, but it focuses very much on coming back to what's going to happen over Gaza. All of these things are pieces of the jigsaw. So I would say that my best guess at the moment is that while it's a live issue, I am not sure that France is ready yet to do it on its own, and each country is looking to another to be able to say, you go first.
Thanks for that. So we're coming to the end of the webinar. This is when I ask if the attendees would consider giving us a donation, because we offer these webinars for free and we would like to continue doing so. So if you do have the ability to give us a donation, then I will pop the link in the chat box right now. And then if you want to consider becoming a friend of the Balfour Project, which is friend with a capital F, meaning that you become a regular giver of any amount, any monthly amount, That will entitle you to free and discounted tickets to different events that we have. For example, our conference that's coming up on the 8th of May. And also exclusive friend events, such as we have meetings, quarterly meetings with different key members of the Balfour Project, and we sometimes have special guests come along and speak as well. And also it just helps us with our funding, our planning for the future, and so forth. We've got a bunch of messages of support for you, Lex, in the chat box. So if anyone wants to write any nice messages for Lex, I will be passing it on to them, to him, and I am
Leave your email, and I'll be happy to respond offline.
Fantastic. And apologies to all of you whose questions I didn't get to. There were hundreds, literally. So I promise you,
Wow.
I didn't ignore any of them, as has been suggested in the chat box. We just didn't have time to go through all of them. But I've posted those donation links in the chat box, and I tried to end every webinar with some kind of message of hope. So do either of you have any?
Well, the situation with respect to UNRWA indeed remains dire, but it has also resulted in an unprecedented interest in the agency and also support for the agency. I mentioned already the first time very significant private sector contributions. I have myself, over the past 12 months or so, given about 100 interviews about UNRWA as both an academic and former long-term UNRWA officials. So I expect that will continue to also support and help to pull the agency through this unprecedented storm.
I would make 2 points. The first one is to remind us all of the old adage that out of crisis often comes opportunity. And I think it gives us a chance to be able to think that the evolution of UNRWA's mandate, and you referred to it, Lex, in your opening remarks, it has evolved. It doesn't have to be stuck in concrete forever in the same way that it is. It's a chance to rethink how to preserve the basic rights of the refugees. And my second reasons for hope is really from the resilience of the refugees who we have known over the years and their ability to be able to deal with so many setbacks, because they are the ones who are the true heroes.
Thank you both. I'm going to end with a comment from Yasmin Ramzan, because she says, keep the trust and hope, which I think is a lovely note to end on. So I want to thank both of you for coming along to this webinar, and I want to thank all of the attendees as well for coming along. Again, please do, I will be sending an email out shortly with the recording links and so forth. So please do share the recordings. It's in video and audio format with anyone that you think might be interested. It's been such an informative talk today and very interesting and very timely. And we hope to see you at the next webinar, and we hope to see you all at the conference as well in May, on the 8th of May. Thank you all so much. Have a lovely evening.
Thanks. Bye-bye.